Okay, this is going to be the first in a series on the restoration of a CPI radio. And what we'll be working on here, it's already partially disassembled, is a CP2000 Base. Now, got a customer who's really wants one of these things working. So, we're going to, I don't want to say Frankenstein one together because that's not the proper term, I guess you could say. But we are going to piece a few of them together to try to come up with at least one working radio, because he already has one with a nuked EEPROM, which basically bricks the radio, and we have another radio, the one you just saw, which has a good EEPROM in it, but a crappy power supply board. Now, this is the one out of his radio with the nuked EEPROM, and you reach down here and get it. This is the power supply out of the radio you just saw, which has been Frankensteined. You can see and get this other one turned around so it's in the same orientation. So you can see this is the bridge rectifier that's supposed to be in this radio, and you can see this is the bridge rectifier that someone has Frankensteined into this radio, which, yeah, it looks like shit, to put it mildly. Also, you can see there's a bunch of burned up components on this board, so yeah, it's going to be easier and less work just to, because I'm going to have to remove it anyhow to properly restore the power supply board, so it has to be completely dismantled to start with. So if I'm going to do it, I might as well just restore a board that's in good, or better condition to start with, because I've got two to choose from. So, which would you pick? 100% factory original, or worked on by some golden screwdriver with a pair of wire crimpers? So, for me, the choice was simple. We'll go with the one that looks fine. So, yeah, so this one can now disappear and go into the parts graveyard in case anything else is ever needed off of it. So this is going to be the first thing we do, is rebuild this power supply board. Now, actually, let me slide this out of the way. The radio itself is fairly straightforward as far as replacing electrolytic capacitors. Get some of these tools out of the way here, because you can see they're all axial leaded. They don't use radials in these. They have all these axial capacitors in here. So they're fairly simple to get to from the underside, because you just stand the radio up, and there's the bottom sides of the circuit boards. So very simple to get to desolder them. Now, you have to be very careful with these boards. I don't want to say they're fragile, because they're not fragile. They're a strong board, a lot stronger than a lot of your modern board. You can even see the fiberglass mesh in there. They're, very rigid. But the circuit traces are very easy to damage on these, and I see a lot of CP radios that have a lot of circuit board damage. Traces that are burned up, or they should have been restored a long time ago before parts started to fail, and, nukes the circuit traces, and it doesn't take a lot of heat to get these solder traces to unlaminate off of the board. Then you have to worry about trying to, do circuit trace repair. So this one's a nice looking radio. Like I say, it's the circuit board. It doesn't look like anything was ever really done to this. It just has definitely had, well, that's not this one, but the other power supply, that board was pretty bad. Now, you will see some clipped wires here. Honestly, it's just the easiest thing to do to extract this board out of the radio. I just nibbled, I always cut them off like this, and I only do that if there's extra wire, okay? I want to make sure I don't go cutting wires off if this is now going to be too short. But there's all the wires that I cut off, there's plenty of extra there to get back down to the proper locations on the circuit boards. But what I'll do is, as you can see, I cut them off really short, but I leave a little bit of the insulation. So, that's basically your wiring. So when you go to put this back together, it's very easy. You can see white and blue, okay, your DC in and your, out. There's a black wire and a pair of orange wires. And that's all that was clipped off of it. And the reason you really have to pull this power supply board, like I say, this is fairly simple to work on. Desolder from this side, pull the parts out from the other side. Now, like I say, this is a early board The board itself is strong, but the circuit traces not so much. So you want to be careful, because this is, as you can see, early double-sided circuit boards. Okay, so you definitely don't want to damage these boards, any of the throughs or anything. So when you remove these capacitors, I highly recommend you use a good desoldering iron. If you're going to be doing this, you should invest in at least a half decent one, a vacuum style desoldering iron. Okay. And what you're going to do is make sure you have all of the solder sucked out, because the nice thing about those irons is they suck it all out. They suck from the back side of the board the whole way through to the top side of the board here. They'll remove all the solder, and then the part just falls out. But like I say, that prevents damaging circuit traces. Even using one of those, you still want to be careful. You want to make sure you have your tip temperature for the desoldering iron fairly low. Just low enough for it to heat the solder, the component lead, and the solder on the top side of the board for it to be sucked through. But you don't want to get any hotter than that. So you want to keep your temperature on. A lot of modern boards, you can crank your temperature up on your desoldering iron, and you don't have to really worry too much about circuit trace damage. But on these, you really want to try and monitor your tip temperature and keep it as low as possible so you don't damage these circuit traces, because they are, like I said, I don't want to say fragile, but they will delaminate very easily from the board. So that's just something to be aware of. But the power supply is a little bit more tricky to work on than the radio itself, because unlike the main part of the radio, where you just flip it upside down to get to the parts, solid aluminum with, of course, 2 power transistors here. So this is where I thought I'd start the video. I've already got all the nuts off, and here's another little tip. When you're doing stuff like this, where you're going to have lots of different little screws and parts and whatnot, try and keep them separated. If nothing else, it just saves you time later on trying to figure out what screw went into what hole and whatnot. I buy these damn things on eBay. I'm sure they come from China, but I buy sticks of 50 of these little containers. They come with lids. I just rarely need the lids. I don't use them really for storage. I use them for putting parts in when I'm working on stuff. But, pick yourself up. These things are extremely cheap. You can buy, I think, bags of 10, but like I say, I usually get them 50 at a time. And then you can, as you're working on it, you can put your, these are the nuts that I took off for all of this, the studs that stick up through, to hold this board down. Here's the 3 screws and insulators and whatnot for holding the bridge rectifier and the transistors on. But, like I say, the little bit of extra time it takes you to pull out of the container and individually, just drop your screws in there, because you're going to drop them on your damn bench anyhow. Just drop them in a container. It's going to save you a lot more time later on. But, like I said, what makes this tricky is you have to remove this board. Now, you can go in, and actually some manufacturers would have told you back in the day when they did circuit boards, like the early circuit boards, that it's fully serviceable from the top. Yeah, I guess it is. You could come in here and try and heat up the solder on this side of the lead, wait for it to melt the whole way through, then pull the lead out, and then try and resolder from this side. But you can see the top side always has, see how close these are, how they're cut out around the traces, trying to make sure you don't have any circuit bridges, and it's an absolute nightmare, honestly, trying to do it that way. The easiest thing to do is just remove the board. As you can see, once you have the power supply board out, it's not that hard, really. You're going to take off the mounting nuts, a couple of the screws. Now, these transistors, of course, are mounted on the underside, so the leads come through the top. But we'll use the desoldering iron. We'll suck out the solder for right here, and then the 2 back here. We'll suck the solder out of those, so the transistors can stay mounted to this plate. But they'll be no longer soldered to this board, and then once I get that off, I can just lift the board up and out. Now, I don't even need to remove the wires from the transformer. I can leave those on there. I can just, all I need to do is stand this up so I can gain access to the bottom side. And then I can get in and change all these electrolytic capacitors. So, there's the first stage of this CP2000 CPI base station radio rebuild, is rebuilding the power supply. So, when I get this out, and I might show you the underside once I get, like, let's say maybe halfway through the recap job. I'll show you the progress. See, I've got the board up now. So, like I say, very simple to do. Just desoldered the 2 bottom transistors there. See the leads sticking up through the holes here. So there's just some nuts You take out a couple screws, because some of them stay in, some of them have to be removed. But so here there's nuts on the top, and this one had to take the screw out. Well, like I say, just desolder them from the top side using the desoldering iron. Suck the solder out, and slides right out of the board. So you can see how it just pulls the solder up through the top side of the board. But now it makes it much easier to get in here to desolder these capacitors from the underside, pop them out to stick the new ones in. So on with the cap change. Getting ready to start changing the caps. One of the first things for starters, don't use cheap capacitors. They didn't use cheap capacitors back then. Don't use cheap capacitors now. You can see, Nichicon, they were good brand capacitors they used in these radios. They were good high-end radios. This was one of the ultra premium radios of the day. Used, top of the line technology for the day. So, don't go sticking junk-ass Chinese capacitors in here. The biggest piece of advice, and speak from personal experience from a few seconds ago, when you're working on anything like this, because I forgot to do it as soon as I lifted this board up, take the damn heat transfer grease off. Inevitably, because it's exactly what I did. I went to grab this thing and right into the... you still see there's some white residue on my fingers into that damn thermal compound. So, take yourself a towel, wipe all the heat transfer grease off of the plate and off the semiconductors. That way you're not, every time you go to move something or pick it up, you're getting this blasted white shit all over you. It's kind of like anti-seize when you're working on vehicles or anything. They call it jump grease for a reason, because it jumps off of whatever you put it onto you. So, like I say, use good caps. This will be getting mainly Sprague's or Vichy capacitors. Sprague capacitors, or, what the hell is the name on these things? There it is. Vichy, and I'll be also upgrading the values on these. So all three of these are 4700s. So I'll be upgrading these somewhere on this can. It has the value. Where the hell is it? No, right there. So you can see it's 6800 microfarads. So I'm going the next size up, which I usually try to do. Go up one size on filter caps, because the more filtering, the better. And we definitely have the real estate, because modern capacitors are just physically smaller in size. So you can see if I lay this one in here, even this one being the next size up is considerably shorter. Still the same diameter, but it's still a little bit shorter. So I mean, shoot, you could almost stick a 10,000 microfarad in here, but seeing as it already has 3 in the power supply system, there's really no need to go with 3 10,000s, but it's definitely not going to hurt to upgrade to 6800s. So there, like I said, there's next tip. Good caps and remove the blasted heatsink grease. Okay, one more little piece of advice I can give for working on something like this. I just remove these 3 caps. Like I say, boards are, very strong. Traces, the adhesion to the boards can be a little bit fragile, so you want to watch your temperature. Now, removing these caps especially, they share some huge planes on one side and the other side of the board. So you can see, look at all this surface area. The capacitors are mounted there, and down here. But that's a huge amount of surface area that sucks the heat right in. And then same on this side. You've got a lot of contact area here, and down here there's just a lot of copper. So that's what that ends up doing, is it's sucking the heat out of your soldering iron. So you've got, your thermal recovery time on your iron is basically dictated by what's known as the thermal reserve, which is the amount of heat energy that's stored inside the heating element. So, as soon as something like that hits these big, huge traces, and then you also have the leads are wicking heat away, you've got this trace trying to absorb a lot of heat, and same thing on the other side, the pads are even bigger on the other side. And like I say, you don't want to overheat this. So what you can do is lower the melting point of the existing solder. I'm going to assume probably, and it's probably a safe assumption because it was mainly what they used back in the day, because they could still manufacture with lead, where nowadays they have to use lead-free solders. But for us in the repair industry, we can still use lead. So, but they probably used 60-40 solder. And that's a good solder. It's fairly strong, has a little bit higher melting temperature, but it has it's fairly strong. Now, me personally, when I do repairs, I use a silver solder. So it's lead, tin, and silver, and I use it because of the silver content, not because of conductivity. I use it because the silver content makes the solder even stronger, so it's extremely strong solder. So especially in mobile applications, it can prevent bad solder joints. But for removing stuff like this, what you can do is before you try to desolder it, is to actually apply extra solder to both sides. And what you want to use is a eutectic solder, which is a composition of 6337, something like this. Okay, this has an extremely low melting temperature. Right off the top of my head, I don't remember what it is, but it's 300, and it's below 400 degrees though. It's, I think, mid 300s, I think, which is extremely low for solder melting temperature. Now, it's not very strong. I don't use this for soldering. This is the main thing it's used for, is if I have really big planes like this, and these will probably be about the only solder joints of these 6, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. So those will probably be the only ones I do this to, because, like I say, they just have these big planes that are sucking heat away, and I don't want to delaminate these traces from the board. Is just take a normal soldering iron. I just use the actual desoldering iron. I'll just hold it on there and apply some of this solder to both sides. Now this will mix with the existing solder on the board. Then, as it starts to mix, it's lowering the, you get a blend of this solder with the existing solder, but it lowers the melting point. So, you don't have to heat it up as much. But just another tip, like I say, low temp solders, and it's the same principle of how for removing surface mount components nowadays, there's a product called Chip Quick. Basically the same principle. It's just a solder. You buy their little tiny kits, and it's ungodly expensive, but it has an even lower melting temperature than this. Now, you definitely don't want to solder with it, but it's meant for removing, like quad flat packs or whatnot off of modern boards. And what you do is you apply that extremely low melting point solder to all 4 sides of, the surface mount component you're trying to remove. And its temperature is so low, you just go around with your soldering iron, you make a molten pool around it, and then you can just lift the entire component up off. But yeah, there's another little tip for you, is use a eutectic, what's known as eutectic solder. Like I say, it's actually a 6337 is the tin lead ratio, but it has very low melting temperature, and that a lot of times can help you safely remove components without damaging circuit traces.